Right. Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches, Bava, Basra, Daf, Kuf, Daled. Um, the next couple of blot are pretty short, and on Shabbos we're not going to learn, and on Friday we're not going to learn. So I'd like to start jumping ahead a little bit, if possible, so that by the time we hit Thursday night, we'll be ready for Sunday's Daf, and that will hopefully help us to get set up in a meaningful way, so that I don't have to think about this over Yom Kippur. So we're starting now at a new Mishnah. This new Mishnah is in the middle, even above the halfway line of Kuf Gimel Amud Beis. The Mishnah writes as follows. Let's say that I'm making a sale to you. Beis kor afar ani mocher lach mida bechebel. I'm going to measure it with a measuring rope. I guess today we'd call it a tape measure, but back in the day they had ropes that were of specific lengths, and they would use that to measure. So because of the way that I phrased my sale, I'm selling you this dirt field, and I'm measuring with a rope. So piches kol shehu yanake. If I shortchanged you in regards to volume of land, then I have to reimburse you for that. And hosir kol shehu yachsir. But if I gave you a little bit more than I should have, then you then need to return that to me. That's because I used a very specific language of mida b'chevel. However, v'imamar hein chaser hein yeser. I'm selling it to you. It's plus or minus, a little bit more, a little bit less. Look, we're not going to get into this nitty gritty, super minutia. That's not how I'm doing this sale. I'm going to give you approximately an acre. So if I say that, then afilu piches rova l'sa. If I measure out a rova, a quarter up against a sa, hosir rova l'sa. So if I shortchanged you or gave you too much of to that amount of rova l'sa, then higio. Then that is considered a kinyan. In other words, you get whatever happens, you keep, right? So if I shortchanged you by accident, a rova of a sa, then you're good to go. And if I gave you too much, then you're the winner. Yoser mikan, if it's more than a quarter, more than a rova l'sa, so then yoser mikan yasa cheshbon. Then you have to say, okay, it's too much. The margin of error was too high, and then we have to rectify the finances. If there is a scenario where the buyer is going to return something, what will he return? He's going to return ma'os. He's going to return cash. We'll discuss why in the Gemara. But if he prefers, namely if the mocher prefers, then he can also have a karka returned to him. This comes to show us that there's a unique power of the mocher in this particular case. That if in fact what was left over, namely the extra of a sadeh that I gave to you, was a beis tisha kabin, that's a significant size field, which in halacha is considered the minimal amount of a chashuv field, or that's in regards to a sadeh. With a gina, it's different. With a gina base chatzikav, a smaller amount. With a Akiva base harova, an even different amount still for the gina, according to Rabbi Akiva. In all of these cases, machzir lo esakarka, since the shiur is chashuv, and you can't force the lokeach to pay cash in those cases. That's a significant amount of overage, and maybe the lokeach doesn't have cash. So the power of the mocher is that in some cases he can take cash, but over here, when the amount is very significant, so then we can't force the buyer to reimburse the overages with cash. He doesn't only return the quarter of a sa, that the rova l'sa that he received in overages, ella es kol hamosar, not just the principal, but even if they went beyond that. And this is a very odd line. We would have thought that it was be written differently. We'll analyze this at the end of the day today. So let's get started with the Gemara. The Gemara is a little bit murky. The reason the Gemara is a little bit murky is because we don't have a presentation in our Mishnah of if I sell you this property just as a stam beis kur. I told you what it's like if I sell it to you mida b'chevel. I told you what the halacha would be if it was hein b'yeser. If I'm going to include the pluses and minuses, it's going to be a lenient sale. But what if I just say I'm selling you a beis kur? So then what happens if there's overages or shortages? Stamamai. So the Gemara points out from our Mishnah that we have opposite implications from our Mishnah. Tashma beis kur afar ani mocher lach mida b'chevel. The Reish of our Mishnah taught a case where it said that if I'm selling you a dirt field and I'm measuring out b'chevel, that's pachos kol shehu yanake yeser kol shehu yachzer. There we said that's a very specific amount. And therefore, if there's any overage at all, because I was very specific in how I measured, so therefore everything has to be evened out. What's implied from this case? Hastama, if I did not specify that it was going to be mida b'chevel, that I was going to measure it out with a rope, but instead I just said base core, just a regular loose language, so then kahin cheser, hein yeser dami. That's the same thing as saying cheser and yeser, because only when we specify mida b'chevel are we so strict, but when you don't specify mida b'chevel, so then, says the Gemara, perhaps we can infer from the Reisha that stama, that if I only say I'm selling you a base core, that itself is a loose language. The problem is that this can't be true necessarily because of a Maseifa. Kuf Dalet Amud Aleph, second line. What did we learn later in our Mishnah? We had said the second case, V'im Amar Lo Hein Chaser Hein Yeser, that I'm making you a sale, and it includes the deviations, the pluses and the minuses. Then, but in that case, where I was specifically intentionally loose with my language, I said, Hein chaser, hein yeser, I'm going to sell you this property. Look, it's going to be plus or minus a rova of a saw. So then higio. So what does that imply? That hastama kimida bechevel dami. That implies that on its own, we are very rigid. So let's just articulate this point very clearly. The two cases of the Mishnah trying to answer the question of what happens if we just say base core stam. The two cases of the Mishnah have opposite implications. The first case of the Mishnah is I'm selling you exactly 1.000 acres. So if you're so specific, then you're of course going to have to return. What is implied if you aren't so specific? That you don't have to return. But the Seifa was the exact opposite. No, whatever, we'll be hamish about it. If we're hamish about it, then what? If we're hamish about it, then don't worry. What does that imply if you aren't hamish about it and you say base core? So because the implications are opposite, therefore the Gemara rejects this as a possible answer to our question. Ella, meha leika lamashmam, you're not able to infer anything from our Mishnah. Because the implications of the Reisha and the Seifa are opposite, it's therefore clear that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when he wrote this Mishnah, did not mean for the implications to be learned the way we thought they would be learned. And therefore, we turn to our second answer, and this will answer our question. Let's just remind ourselves, when we say base core stama, mai. It says the Gemara, 6 lines down on Kuf Daled Amud Aleph, Toshma, base core afar ani mocher lach. This is another brayso, so this is not our Mishnah. Let's say you have that language, base core afar ani mocher lach. So that's loose language, doesn't have any specificity to it. Base core afar ani mocher lach, and approximately a base core that's even looser language. Hein chaser, hein yeser ani mocher lach, even super loose language. I'll sell you plus or minus. We're not going to be so strict with one another. So there, it seems pretty clear that in that case that the kinyan still works, even if we have our standard margin of error of a rova l'sa. Alma, what that implies is that stamanami kein cheser hein yeser dami. It seems to be that we have our answer. It seems to be that if we say it's stam, because this brisa, not our Mishnah is unclear, but this brisa seems to answer the question that this case is higio, that the kinyan actually works. So says the Gemara, you can't bring a raya from that brisa either. Why not? Because Hassam, in that brisa, when it said these three languages of base kur afarni mocher lach, kibes kur afarni mocher lach, hein cheser, hein yeser ani mocher lach, Hassam prushe kamefarish. Each line is explaining the next one. It's not three cases. It's one case. And the one case is where we specified hen cheser, hen yeser. So ezu base kur she kibes kur, kigon de amar le hen cheser, hen yeser. That's how we would explain the brisa. And therefore, we don't have an answer to our question. Our question was about base core stama. Just if I say I'm selling you a base core, well, what does that mean? Do we then allow for the margin of error of a rova base star? Yes or no? We tried to answer from the brisa, but the Gemara says, wait 1 second. Perhaps the brisa is talking about a case of hein cheser, hein yeser. So says the Gemara, wait 1 second. Maskiv lo Ravashi, im kain, why does it say ani mocher lach lamali? If what you're saying is that each case is explaining the previous one in this brisa, as you just tried to say, why did it say ani mocher lach twice? If it says ani mocher lach twice, that implies that those are distinct cases. Elalav, it must therefore be that shma mina, that if a person says a base kur stama, I'm selling you a base core of dirt, That's Kehain Chaser Hein Yeser Dami Shmamina. That's what the Gemara concludes. The Gemara concludes that if I say to you, I'm selling you this farm, and I'm not doing any specifying, so then we allow for the margin of error of a rova to a sa, which is, we'll see soon, is 7.5 cup. So if there's a rova to a cup, that means if there's a margin of 7.5 per sa, 7.5 cup per sa, no problem. That's part of the sale. So stam is the same thing as specifying margin of error. That's what the Gemara says. Our stam is lenient. Our stam is not strict. That brings us to the two dots, a little bit more than halfway down on Kuf Daled Amud Aleph. We'll be going to the bottom of Kuf Daled Amud Beis, and then we'll stop. Mahu machzir lo maus. We spoke about this in our Mishnah, that when there are deviations that warrant a return, we said that the mocher can, in certain cases, force the payment of maus, and in other cases not. So says the Gemara, we had said in the Mishnah, liyapos kochos shel mocher aminan. Our Mishnah seemed to say that it's liyapos koach of the mocher, to show that sometimes the mocher can say, yes, there's overages, you have to pay cash. But liyapos kochos shel lokech lo aminan, there's never a case where we're leaning and edging on the side of the lokech. For sure there is one, and here's the example of it. V'hatanya, 2/3 of the way down. Pires shivas kavenu mechza likur. If you shortchange a buyer by 7.5 kav per kur, ohoser shivas kaben umechza likur, or if you have extra 7.5 kav per kur, higio. That margin of error relative to a kur, our case was a sa, but relative to a kur, that's considered an acceptable margin of error. Yoser mikan, look at this language, more than that, let's say it's not 7.5 kav, it's 8.5 kav per kur. Kofenes ha-mocher limkor. What do we see? That the lokeach can force the mocher to do something, to sell. Ves ha-lokeach likach. And sometimes, of course, the mocher can force the lokeach to buy. But this line of kofenes ha-mocher limkor, that the lokeach can sometimes force a mocher to sell, that shows us that unlike our Mishnah, which seems to say that only the mocher has the power to force the lokeach, in this brisa we see that sometimes the lokeach has the power to force the mocher. So we seem to have a stira between our Mishnah and the brisa. So it says the Gemara Hasam, that brisa is dealing with something different. In a regular case, only the mocher is able to force. But Hasam, in the case of the brisa, that's Kigon Dahavi Yakira Me'ikara, that really the market value was very high when we agreed to make the sale. V'zal hashta, and now that I now owe you some property because you paid me with some overages, v'zal hashta, now it's much cheaper. The amrinan lay, the lokeach can tell the mocher, i'ara yavasli abli kazula dehashta, you should pay me at today's rate. So under those circumstances, yes, that's what the Bryce is talking about. But where the market value doesn't change from the beginning of the sale to the end, then the mocher is the one who has more power than the lokeach. I asks the Gemara, wait 1 second, we have a brisa that opposes this idea about Tanya. Show no sein lo, kisha'ar shelokach mimenu. Unlike what the okimta of the brisa said, where the lokeach can say to the mocher, ara yavasli habli kazola dehashta, that we follow today's market value. But this brisa says, no sein lo kishar shelokach mimenu. We only look at the value on day one, not on the day of delivery. Says the Gemara, how do we answer that? Hasam, that case where it's kishar shalokach mimenu could go into have a zula meikara, the yikra lahashta. That's when the market was reversed. It wasn't flat, and it wasn't in the direction of getting cheaper, but it went from cheaper to more expensive. In that case, it's true. Then we pay like the original amount, which was a little bit higher. We had mentioned in the Brisa Shim shiur b'sadeh base tes kabin in the Mishnah actually that if in my margin of error, I left over tisha kabin, a field that is 9 kav, so that's considered chashuv. Omar Rav Huna, how do we measure this tes kabin? Is the tes kabin relative to the whole field irrelevant of the size? And if so, as long as there's any tes kabin, it has to be returned. Or no, is it that the 9 kabin is per measure of ground? Is it an objective number or is it a subjective number? Is the 9 kabin relative to the volume of the field or is it not? This is a machlokes amoraim, 3 lines from the bottom. Amar Rav Huna, tes kabin she'amru ve'afilu bebeka gdola. Tes kabin is tes kabin. The second there's an overage of tes kabin, the lokeach has to return it to the mocher, even in a very large bika. However, Rav Nachman argues the other way, and he says, Amar nosein shivas kavenu mechza l'chol kur v'kur. He says you're allowed to have 7.5 kav margin of error for every kur. So by sharp contrast, according to Rav Huna, even only 9 kav would create a need for return. But according to Rav Huna, if you have a field that's, let's say, 5 kur, and an acceptable margin of error is very subjective, it's 7.5 kav to a kur, that means you could have 35 plus whatever it is, 2.5, 37.5 kav, and you don't have to return anything because it's just relative to the kur. It's not relative to the field. It's broken up into pieces. So huge machlokes in regards to practical outcomes. That's what Rav Nachman holds. And as we turn to the top of Kuf Daled Amud Beis on the top line, he adds another din, and this din is going to be questioned. Rav Nachman says, if there is one distinct field that's 9, Latishas Kabin, then Hadre, then it has to be given back. So the Gemara has a question against Rav Nachman, a couple of them. Esvei Rabbi Rav Nachman, you're saying that if there's only one sa and then there's 9 kabin, then you're definitely going to remove it. I'm not sure that's true, because what did we see in our Mishnah? Shim shiur besade beis tishas kabin. We said in our Mishnah that if one left over 9 kav, it has to be returned. But according to Rav Nachman, that should only be with 1 kav. And in this case, lav de zavan le kuraim, maybe our Mishnah is talking about a case where 2 kur are returned, and therefore his din would not be true, because he holds that it's subjective to the number of kur in the field. Says the Gemara, lo de zavan le kur. Our Mishnah must be talking about a case where there was only a kur being sold. Uvegina beis chatzi kav lav de zavan le sasaim. Same question. In the Gina, we had said in our Mishnah that the shiur was a chatzi kav, which is the equivalent of tisha kav, and in that a chatzi kav is chashuv. Says the Gemara, maybe that's talking about more than 1 kur. No, lo de zavan le sa. Really, we were only talking about chatzi kav against the sa. So that's not a kasha on Rav Nachman either. Then we said, Rabbi Akiva beis rova. According to Rabbi Akiva, he said this, the shiur of chashivus by a gina is a beis rova. My lav de zavan leisa. Maybe there also, the case of Rav Nachman is talking about a full sa and not a beis rova, not a smaller amount. Says Gemara, no, lo de zavan lechatzi sa. It was only a half a sa. So we never had 9 kav against multiple sa, according to Rav Nachman, which was what we thought. And the Gemara says 1/3 of the way down that boy Ravashi sada benase is gina benase sada mai. Remember that the margin of error in a sada is tisha kabin. The margin of error in a field is a chatzi kav. What if you convert a field to a garden, halachically? The difference between them is how much water is in demand. In your average field, you don't need so much water. But if you're growing a garden, that really does need a lot more water. And there were halachic differences, because if I'm selling you a sadeh, my margin of error is 9 kav. If I'm selling you a garden, it's chatzi kav. That's 1/18 of 9 kav. That's a massive difference in margin of error. So if I say I'm selling you this field, we need to know, is that field a sadeh or a gina? The margin of error differs from one to the next. So if I convert my sadeh to a gina or my gina to a sadeh, what do we do with the margins of error? Says the Gemara, Teku, we don't know the answer to that question. Tana, we have another source in a brisa. If the field that was a margin of error that the lokeach bought, if the field was close to the property of the original mocher, afilu kolshu machzir lo karka, then we have to give it back to him, because it will just adjoin to the property that exists, because it's right now. If I'm the mocher, it's right next to my property. Boy Ravashi says, what if it's bor mausha tafsik? What if, yes, you're right, what if there is a field that I shouldn't have given you, but it was included in the sale, and there's a bor separating what I gave you from the field that's a margin of error? Or amasamai mausha tafsik, what if it's on the other side of the aqueduct? Derech harabim mausha tafsik, what if it's on the other side of the public street? Richva de dikla mausha tafsik, what if there's a row of dekel trees separating the field I sold you and the margin of error field that you shouldn't have received? Teku, we don't know the answer to any of these questions. And last but not least for tonight, we had this weird language that not only do you have to return the principal, the rova, the margin of error, but you also have to give back anything beyond that. Says the Gemara, klape laya. What are you talking about? It should be the exact opposite. It should be not only do you have to return what's beyond the margin of error, but you even have to return the margin of error. Pasha that you should. That doesn't make sense to say it the way our Mishnah said it. So the Gemara reverses it. Tani Ravin Barav Nachman, you're right. Loas hamosar bilvad machzir lo. Not just the extras do you return. Ella kol haravayin kulan. I might have thought that maybe I get to keep the margin of error. I just have to give back whatever is above the margin of error. Let's say the margin of error is 9. So I have to give back, and I was given 13. I just have to give back 4. So I'm back to no. You have to give back everything. And that's just a correction that the Gemara makes. So tomorrow, in Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll push forward a little bit to get ahead of the curve for Yom Kippur. I know it's early in the week, but not every blot is so short, even though many of them are. And in Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll be all ready for Yom Kippur. Wishing you all a Gemar Chasima Tova.